The letter arrived at Marchbrook Cottage on a morning when the frost had not yet lifted from the hedgerows, sealed with a crest that had not been pressed into wax in nearly a decade, the rearing hound of the House of Ashworth, Dukes of Ashcombe. Rosalind Hartley turned it over twice before she dared to break the seal, for she knew, as anyone in the county knew, that the Ashworths did not write letters. They summoned. Inside was not a summons to tea, nor an invitation to mourn properly among family, as she had once hoped might come. It was a deed. A single sheet of vellum, dry and brittle at its corners, transferring to her, Rosalind Hartley, widow of Captain Edmund Ashworth, the whole of Thorncliffe Hall, its grounds, its outbuildings, and its debts. She did not know then that the Duke had chosen those words deliberately. Its debts. He had wanted her to read them before she read anything else. She had expected nothing from the Ashworths. She had, if she was honest with herself in the quiet hours before dawn, expected to be forgotten entirely, the way a pressed flower is forgotten between the pages of a book no one opens again. 2 years a widow, and in all that time not a single member of her husband's family had called upon her, had written to ask how she managed, had so much as inquired whether she ate well through the winter. And now this, a house she had never seen, a title to land she had never walked, and Coffers, the solicitor's covering note informed her with the flat courtesy of a man delivering bad news he did not intend to soften, that stood entirely empty. She would learn, in the months that followed, that the Duke had not given her Thorncliffe out of guilt, nor out of family feeling, nor even out of duty. He had given it to her because he believed, as most of the county would come to believe, that the gift was in fact a punishment, a genteel way of banishing an inconvenient widow to a ruin from which she could never climb, so that she might disappear from Ashcombe society without the unpleasantness of anyone having pushed her. No one in the household knew that the Duke had misjudged her entirely. To understand what Rosalind carried with her on the day she first saw Thorncliffe's gates, one must understand what had been taken from her, slowly, in the years before. She had been Rosalind Vane before she was Rosalind Ashworth, the daughter of a country parson with more books than income, raised in a rectory where affection was steady, but money was not. She had met Captain Edmund Ashworth at an assembly in Bath when she was 19, and he had been, by every account of those who remembered him, a young man entirely unlike his family, quiet where they were imperious, generous where they were calculating, more at ease in a stable yard than a ballroom. He had married her against his mother's wishes and his father's cold silence. And for 3 years they had lived a life that was, if not grand, entirely their own, a small house near his regiment, a garden she tended herself, evenings spent reading aloud by a fire that never quite kept the chill from the corners of the room. Then came the accident. A training exercise gone wrong on a stretch of coastal road, a carriage overturned in a storm. And Edmund dead before a physician could be summoned. She was 22 and widowed and utterly without standing among people who had never fully accepted her to begin with. The Ashworths did not attend the funeral in any capacity beyond the obligatory. The Duke sent a wreath and a card bearing only his signature, no words of comfort. No acknowledgement that a son had been lost as well as a husband. The Duchess did not come at all. And Edmund's sister, Lady Beatrice Ashworth, who had never once called Rosalind by her Christian name in 3 years of acquaintance, sent nothing. She did not know then that Beatrice's silence was not born of indifference, but of something far more deliberate. For 2 years Rosalind had lived quietly on the small annuity her husband's modest savings afforded her, in a rented cottage 3 counties from Ashcombe, teaching pianoforte to the daughters of local families to fill the gaps her income left bare. She had told herself she wanted nothing further from the Ashworths. No name, no inheritance, no acknowledgement. And yet when the letter came, when she read the words Thorncliffe Hall in her husband's family's unmistakable hand, something in her chest had tightened with a feeling she did not immediately recognize as hope. She would come to understand, in time, that hope was precisely what the Duke had not intended to give her. The carriage that brought her to Thorncliffe 3 weeks later crested a hill just after noon, and Rosalind saw the house for the first time through a curtain of thin autumn rain. It had been once a handsome property. She could see the bones of that former grandeur, even in ruin, the way one recognizes beauty in an aged face by the structure beneath the lines. 3 stories of grey stone, a central block flanked by 2 wings, tall windows that must once have caught the morning sun across a lawn that was now overgrown to the height of a man's waist. But the roof of the eastern wing had partially collapsed, exposing rafters to the sky like the ribs of some great fallen animal. Ivy had claimed the western face so thoroughly that it seemed to be holding the stones together rather than pulling them apart. Half the windows were boarded, the others simply broken, black and empty as missing teeth. The housekeeper who greeted her at the door, an elderly woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who had remained at Thorncliffe on a wage the estate could no longer properly pay her, out of what she called simple stubbornness, did not attempt to soften the truth. "There's rot in the east wing beams, my lady, and has been for years. The tenant farms haven't seen a proper harvest reckoning since old Mr. Ashworth's time. Begging your pardon, the Duke's uncle, that would be. The accounts are in the library, what's left of them. I'll tell you plainly, as no one else will, this house has been left to fail on purpose, and I don't rightly know why." Rosalind stood in the entrance hall that first evening, beneath a chandelier gone black with tarnish, and looked up at a portrait of a stern-faced man in an old-fashioned coat. The uncle Mrs. Pruitt had mentioned, she would later learn. A man named Josiah Ashworth, who had died some 15 years past, and whose name no one in the family spoke aloud. She did not know then that the answer to Mrs. Pruitt's question was hanging on that very wall, waiting for someone patient enough to look for it. The first weeks at Thorncliffe were consumed by simple survival. Rosalind learned quickly that pride was a luxury she could not afford. She wrote to the few tenant farmers still working the estate's outer fields, and asked, plainly, what they needed rather than what tradition dictated a lady of the house ought to say. She sold what little jewellery remained to her, a modest string of pearls, a brooch that had been her mother's, not for finery, but for seed, for roof slate, for the wages of 2 labourers willing to work on the promise of eventual payment. The county watched with the particular cruelty of people who expect to be entertained by another's failure. Lady Beatrice, upon hearing that the widow had actually gone to live at Thorncliffe rather than sell her claim and vanish as expected, was heard to remark at a dinner in Ashcombe that the girl would last a single winter before crawling back to whatever rectory had spawned her. Rosalind did not crawl back. She did not know then that Beatrice's scorn concealed something closer to fear. It was in the library, on a wet evening in her 2nd month, that she found the first thread of the mystery that would come to define her time at Thorncliffe. She had gone in search of old estate ledgers, hoping to understand the property's finances well enough to argue her case to the estate's solicitor, a Mr. Pendleton, who visited quarterly and treated her, she felt, as an inconvenience rather than a client. Behind a false panel in the library wall, discovered only because a swollen damp board had warped and left a gap, she found a small collection of letters tied with faded ribbon, hidden as though someone had wanted them to survive the years without being found. The letters were from Josiah Ashworth, the uncle in the portrait, addressed to a man named Robert Finch, who Mrs. Pruitt identified, after some thought, as the family's solicitor from a generation past. The very firm, in fact, that Mr. Pendleton had inherited. She did not read them all that night. She did not know then that within those pages lay the answer to why Thorncliffe had been left to rot, why the Ashworths' fortune had grown thin in a single generation despite the family's title and lands, and why her husband, Edmund, had once told her, in an offhand remark she had not understood at the time, and had nearly forgotten, that he would never touch a shilling of his father's money if he could help it. Word travelled, as it does in small counties, that the widow at Thorncliffe was not failing as gracefully as expected. She had, by the spring, repaired enough of the roof to stop the worst of the water damage. She had convinced 2 tenant families to stay rather than leave for better managed land elsewhere by the simple expedient of listening to their grievances and acting on them. She had begun, with Mrs. Pruitt's help, to restore the kitchen garden, and the modest sale of its produce at the local market had become, to everyone's quiet astonishment, a small but genuine source of income. It was at this point that Lady Beatrice came to call. She arrived unannounced, in a carriage far too fine for the condition of Thorncliffe's drive, and swept into the entrance hall with the particular grace of a woman accustomed to controlling every room she entered. She was, Rosalind noted, older than she remembered from the wedding, perhaps 38 now, and there was something brittle beneath her composure that had not been there before. "You've made quite a project of yourself," Beatrice said, surveying the hall with an expression Rosalind could not quite read. "Father did not think you would stay." "Your father did not think much of me at all, as I recall," Rosalind answered, with more steadiness than she felt. Something flickered across Beatrice's face, not offence, but something closer to discomfort. "He is not a cruel man, whatever you believe. He is a frightened one. There is a difference, though I grant you it rarely looks like one from the outside." She did not explain what he was frightened of, and Rosalind did not press her, though she would think of that remark many times in the weeks that followed. Beatrice left, without ever stating the true purpose of her visit, though she paused at the library door on her way out and asked, with a carelessness that did not quite convince, whether Rosalind had found the old family papers to be in good order. She did not know then that Beatrice already knew about the hidden letters, and had come to Thorncliffe hoping to learn whether Rosalind had found them first. The truth, when it began to surface, did so in fragments, the way silt rises slowly from the bottom of a still pond when something disturbs the water. Rosalind returned to the hidden letters in earnest that summer, cross-referencing them with the estate ledgers she had painstakingly restored to order. What she found troubled her more with each passing week. Josiah Ashworth, the Duke's uncle, and the man responsible for managing the family's fortune in the years before Rosalind's marriage, had systematically diverted funds from the estate's accounts, not through crude theft, but through a slower, more patient scheme involving falsified tenant rents, inflated repair costs, and a series of loans to fictitious parties that were never repaid because they had never truly existed. The scheme had very nearly bankrupted the dukedom, and when it was at last discovered, by Josiah's own nephew, the current duke, then a younger man newly come into his responsibilities, the family had made a decision that Rosalind found, the more she understood it, both cowardly and profoundly sad. Rather than expose Josiah publicly, which would have ruined the family name entirely, the Duke had quietly absorbed the loss, driven Josiah from Thorncliffe in disgrace but under a cover story of ill health, and sealed the entire matter under a solicitor's discretion that had lasted, unbroken, for 15 years. But the loss had never truly been absorbed. It had simply been hidden, passed down like a slow poison through the family's finances, starving Thorncliffe of the repairs it needed, while the Duke's main seat at Ashcombe continued to prosper on what remained. And Edmund, her Edmund, had known something of it. She found, tucked among Josiah's letters, a single note in her late husband's own hand, dated some 6 years before his death, addressed to his father, and evidently never sent. "Father, I do not ask for Thorncliffe's income, nor any part of what remains, for I want no part of a fortune built on what Uncle Josiah did to those tenants who trusted him. I ask only that you tell the truth of it some day to whoever comes after us to bear the name." She did not know then, reading those words by candlelight with her hands trembling slightly, that her husband had understood the shape of the family's shame long before she had ever met him, and that his refusal to touch his father's money, which she had once taken for simple modesty, had in fact been a quiet act of conscience that had cost him his father's favour for the whole of his adult life. Years later, she would understand that Edmund had given her, without ever intending it, the very key she would need to save the house he had never wanted for himself. But the truth hidden inside those papers was far more dangerous than a decades-old embezzlement, for it implicated someone still living. Continuing to trace the ledgers forward from Josiah's disgrace, Rosalind discovered that the diverted funds had not vanished into nothing after Josiah's departure. A portion had been quietly redirected, in the years immediately following, into an account held not by the Ashworth estate, but by a private trust, one whose sole beneficiary, upon careful and repeated reading of the trust's founding document, which she found folded inside the false panel alongside the letters, was named as Beatrice Ashworth. She sat with that discovery for 3 full days before she could bring herself to believe it. Beatrice had been young when the trust was established, no more than a girl of 16, and Rosalind could not at first imagine that a child could have orchestrated such a thing. That a note attached to the trust, written in Miss Pendleton's own hand, the very solicitor who still managed the Ashworths' affairs, made clear that the arrangement had been Josiah's final act before his departure. A gift to his favourite niece, meant to ensure she, at least, would never suffer the family's coming hardship, regardless of what became of the estate itself. Beatrice, then, had known for years, perhaps her whole adult life, that a portion of the fortune stolen from Thorncliffe's tenants sat quietly in her name, untouched, while the house that should have benefited from it crumbled. It explained everything Rosalind had not understood: Beatrice's brittleness beneath her composure, her strange remark about the Duke being frightened rather than cruel, her scorn for Rosalind's efforts to restore a house whose ruin she had, in some sense, always been complicit in maintaining, if only through her silence. No one in the household knew that Rosalind now held the power to unmake Beatrice's entire standing in society with a single letter to the family solicitor, or worse, to the county at large. She did not know then that she would choose not to. She confronted Beatrice not with accusation, but with the letters themselves, laid plainly on the library table between them on an autumn afternoon when the light came golden low through the newly repaired windows. Beatrice went very pale, and for a long moment said nothing at all. When she finally spoke, her voice had none of its usual command. "I was 16 when Pendleton told me of it. I did not ask for it. I did not know, not truly, what Uncle Josiah had done to earn it, not until I was much older and pieced it together myself, the way you have now." She looked, Rosalind thought, suddenly much older than her years. "I have spent every year since wondering what it would cost me to give it back, and every year finding a reason to wait a little longer." "It is not too late," Rosalind said. "You would forgive it so easily?" "I would not call it easy. But I have learned something in this house, these past months, that I do not think you have yet had the chance to learn." Rosalind gestured toward the window, toward the fields beyond where 2 tenant families now worked land that had, that very year, produced its first true harvest in a decade. A ruin can be repaired. It is slower than anyone tells you, and harder, and there is no single moment where it is finished. But it can be repaired, if someone is willing to do the unglamorous work of it, year after year, without expecting to be thanked. Beatrice did not weep, though her hands trembled where they rested on the table. "And what is it you want from me?" "The truth. Told to your father, in your own words, and the funds returned to Thorncliffe's tenants, who were owed them long before either of us was born, to inherit any part of this mess." She did not know then whether Beatrice would agree. But she would learn, within the week, that even the coldest members of a family carry within them some capacity for a conscience long suppressed, and that Beatrice's cooperation, once given, would prove the very thing that finally brought the Duke himself to Thorncliff's door. The Duke of Ashcombe arrived at Thorncliffe on a grey November morning, unannounced save for a brief note delivered an hour before his carriage, and Rosalind received him in the library among the very evidence of his family's long-buried shame. He was older than she remembered from her wedding day, greyer, more stooped, though his bearing had lost none of its natural authority. He looked, for a long moment, at the portrait of his Uncle Josiah on the wall, and then at the letters laid out upon the table, and something in his face seemed to collapse very slowly, like a wall giving way after years of unseen pressure. "I sent you here to fail quietly," he said at last, without preamble, as though the admission had been waiting a long time to be spoken. "I will not insult you by pretending otherwise. I believed you would take one look at this ruin and return the deed to me within a season, and I would be free of the burden of you without ever having to say a cruel word aloud." "I know," Rosalind said quietly. "I have known for some months now. And yet you stayed. I had nowhere better to go, Your Grace, and no great fortune to lose in the trying." She met his eyes steadily. "But that is not, I think, why I stayed in the end." She told him then of Edmund's unsent letter, the one that asked only for the truth to be told, someday, to whoever came after. She watched the Duke's face as she read the words aloud, and saw in it, for the first time since she had known him, something that was not pride, nor coldness, nor calculation, but simple, unguarded grief. "He never told me he knew," the Duke said softly. "I thought I had hidden it well enough that no one in the family suspected. I was a coward, Mrs. Ashworth. I chose the family's reputation over the tenant's due, and I let this house rot rather than face what repairing it honestly would require me to admit." "Then let us begin admitting it," Rosalind said. "Together, if you are willing." He did not know then, nor did she, quite yet, how much the county would come to respect a duke who chose, at last, to make a public reckoning of an old family wrong, rather than continue burying it. But within the year, the story of Thorncliffe's restoration would become known not as a tale of a discarded widow's failure, but as the very opposite, a story the whole of the county would tell for a generation after. The reckoning, when it came, was neither swift nor without cost. The Duke, with Beatrice's reluctant but genuine cooperation, made a formal accounting to the tenant families whose rents had been falsified a generation before, and arranged, through funds drawn at last from the long-hidden trust, for their compensation, along with a full restoration of Thorncliffe's remaining debts. Mr. Pendleton, the solicitor who had kept the family's secret for a fee across 2 decades, was quietly relieved of the Ashworth accounts, though the Duke, to Rosalind's private surprise, chose not to ruin the man publicly, only to end the long complicity between them. Beatrice did not emerge from the affair unscathed in society's eyes. There were whispers, as there always are, and some doors in Ashcombe that closed to her that had once stood open. But she remained, in the years that followed, a frequent visitor to Thorncliffe, and something between her and Rosalind that had begun as suspicion slowly, unevenly, became something that might honestly be called friendship. The house itself continued its long restoration through the following 2 years. No longer starved of funds nor of purpose, the east wing's roof was rebuilt in full. The gardens, which Rosalind had first tended out of simple necessity, grew into something the county began to speak of with genuine admiration. Visitors came, in time, simply to walk the grounds and see what had been made of a house everyone had once considered beyond saving. She did not seek to remarry nor to leave Thorncliffe for grander society, though offers came, as they will to a woman who has quietly become the subject of admiring gossip rather than pitying gossip. She found, in the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding what had been left to fail, a satisfaction she had not expected to find anywhere again after Edmund's death. The particular contentment of having taken a thing everyone had given up on and proven, patiently, year by year, that it had never truly been beyond saving at all. On the 3rd anniversary of her arrival at Thorncliffe, Rosalind stood once more in the entrance hall beneath the chandelier, cleaned now, its crystals catching the afternoon light rather than gathering dust, and looked up at the portrait of Josiah Ashworth, the uncle whose long-hidden theft had nearly destroyed this house, and whose discovery had, in the strangest way, given her the chance to save it. She thought of her husband's unsent letter, of the conscience he had carried quietly and alone for so many years before his death, unable to change what his family would not yet admit to. She thought that he would have been glad, in the end, not that the truth had been ugly, but that it had finally been told, and that the house he had refused to profit from dishonestly had become, instead, something built honestly, stone by stone, debt by repaid debt. The county that had once whispered of the widow banished to a ruin now spoke, instead, of Lady Ashworth of Thorncliffe, whose garden parties in summer drew families from 3 counties over, whose tenant farms were spoken of as a model of fair management, whose quiet patience had turned a punishment meant to break her into the very thing that restored her family's name. She had not been given a fortune, in the end. She had been given a ruin, and empty coffers, and a house full of secrets no one wished to speak aloud. But she had learned, in 3 years of unglamorous labour and difficult truths, that a ruin is not always a sentence. Sometimes it is simply an invitation, to whoever is patient enough to answer it, to build something worth keeping, out of what everyone else had already agreed to let fall. If you found some part of yourself in Rosalind's patience tonight, in the quiet, unglamorous work of rebuilding what others had given up on, stay a while longer with us and follow along for the next story from the old estates of England, where every ruin, it seems, still has something worth uncovering.